Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Snow. I am a news anchor from Britain. I work with Channel 4, which is a public service channel, and we put out a 1-hour news program every night, which has both news, interviews, and the rest of it. And I am joined here today by three eminent journalists. And we have Gardenia Trezzini, who is the boss of Euronews, the editor-in-chief. And Euronews is about to go out in 13 languages, goes out in 11 across Europe and beyond, and is really involved in a huge number of different enterprises, which Gardenia will elucidate later. And then Anva Versi, who is in a very different corner of the woods, Africa. He does African banking, African business, and New African, three great publications which are read in some of the most remote areas of Africa and in some of the most densely populated. So thank you very much for joining us. And finally, Brian Kelly, editor-in-chief and head of content at US News. He has been there, I think, for about 12 years in that position, and is very well versed in both online and the old-fashioned hard print media experience. So let's begin with the negative. I would argue probably that the media does a very bad job with education. Education as a subject for the media is of very low importance, and it's a horrible thing to have to say that. But I think you, Brian, would argue that you're probably an exception to this rule.
Well, I agree with you, John, and it's always tricky to be critical of one's colleagues, but when I look at the media business broadly cast, I have to say that's true. And I have worked for other publications that didn't do such a good job of covering education. I happen to be at a publication that spends about 30% of its resources on education-related subjects. So we're very well known for our rankings of universities and colleges and graduate schools. On the U.S., we do undergraduate ranking. We do rank in international universities and continue to expand in that area. So we really come at it from a very different perspective. It's not as much about the pure journalism and the writing as it is about the data and the consumer information. So we see it through a different prism.
I think there are two levels in this, and that is, the one level is how we deal with education as a subject, and the other, of course, is what we do to educate anybody. And those are two very big subjects which we will try to address as we go on. But would you argue that Euronews is involved as an educator, and is it perhaps also involved in reporting education?
The answer is yes, but first I'd like to underline that for Rolling News channel, the first mission is not education. In general, it's just to deliver breaking news, hard news information. Then we can discuss a long time if information and education are the same things or if they merge somewhere. Regarding Euronews, I can say that we have a peculiarity because we have chosen in our strategy of having a huge amount of magazines besides news. So we have a wide scope of topics. First of all, education. I'm here, so it's the right place to say we have a very good weekly program in cooperation with the Qatar Foundation about education, learning world. But we have dozens of magazines exploring science.
Let me just stop you there, because
yes.
that's rather an interesting fact. So you produce an educational strand which you would not produce if you didn't get assistance from the Qatar Foundation.
Maybe not, you are right, but you know perfectly that for 24-hour news channel, as I told before, the first goal is deliver news, and then you have to analyze and to go more in depth, of course. And we think that now the real competition between channels, rolling news channel, it's not just in delivering breaking news. Everybody can do it easily. We receive all the same pictures coming from the agency. We all receive the same headline coming from news agency. So for breaking news, we can all be good at the same level. But for delivering more content and to go more in depth, we have to change our strategy. Of course, for a channel, it's difficult to put a huge amount of money in diversifying the content, of course. But with some partnership, good partnership, you can do it easily.
Mm. Anva, where do you fit in the educational world? Did you?
Yeah, I think we come from a very different background because, in fact, the reason d'etre for our magazine back in the 1960s was the total ignorance within Africa of Africa. East Africa knew nothing of West, nothing of South, etc. So really those magazines which were based in London and Paris set out to fill those gaps. So virtually every issue explains something about West Africa or Nigeria or the politics there. And in many ways we have continued that trend. We have now moved on to things like going into oil and gas, all the complications of oil and gas. Because you have this great expectation, Ghana's got oil, we'll all be very rich, we'll all become Kuwait. And then you have to try and explain how it is funded, how it is financed, all the stuff that goes through with it. And we find that there's a remarkable desire to learn about it. We also run what we call a business school, which has now become very, very sophisticated. We have lecturers from all over the world explaining quite high level of stuff. So I think in Africa, because of the dearth of information for such a long time, I think the media has played that role quite actively. So I would think that, yes, we don't see ourselves as educators as such. We see ourselves as explainers.
Well, what is the motivation when you are talking to people in East Africa about Ghana? Is that because you think they ought to know about Ghana, or because there's actually a commercial reason for knowing about Ghana, or there is a mutual reason for knowing about Ghana?
Yes, I mean, there should be a mutual reason for knowing about Ghana, because inter-African trade until recently was virtually nothing.
Yeah.
Because, largely because of ignorance. And we found that the more you explained things to people and the more there was inter-regional kind of communications through various organizations, SADC and COMESA and so on and so forth, you find that over the last 6-7 years, the volumes of trade have increased because you know what the Ghanaians do.
Well, now, I'm very, very keen to encourage anybody who wants to contribute from the floor to contribute and to take the conversation in any direction they like. But I wanted first to try to look at the question of why education as a subject, as an issue, is so low down the agenda. Given that in the end the sort of fundamental core human dependencies are education and health, both of them actually, unless they have commercial dimensions, which have some attraction to you, get very short shrift in terms of news coverage. Why?
Hard question, but it's not just about education. Education doesn't bring money, as you say, but unless if there is some commercial, of course, purposes. And in general, it's considered for TV really boring. When we decided a few years ago to start this program on education, we asked ourselves if we really want to do it, because it's really difficult from the visual point of view to show educational stories. So you have to travel, you have to report, you have to look for these, and it's costly, of course.
But education is a political issue as well, isn't it?
It is a political issue, and not. For instance, we had recently a very animated, passionate debate in one of our talk shows between two European MPs accusing each other of using education as propaganda, because one of the MPs is a representative of the Commission of Culture of the Parliament, and they propose to learn European Union issues in the school, and the other was a British MP, you can imagine. So, of course, it is a political issue, and it's the reason why you have to touch in a very prudent way.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think education per se as an issue.
I think it's just not sexy enough. I think
And
the
yet,
two.
when, you see, if you take your argument that people reading your magazine
Yes.
want to know more about other bits of Africa,
Yes.
surely they might also want to know about other ways in which other African countries are tackling the education deficit.
Yes.
How are they getting more kids into school?
Yeah.
How are they, how are they financing? Are they turning to the private sector? Is the church doing it? Is it NGOs? Surely it's actually quite a fertile subject.
It is a very fertile subject, but to be perfectly honest, John, until I came to this meeting today, it was something I would just never think about. You just take education for granted. The schools are being run somehow, somewhere. And the education we're getting is probably the only way you can get this education. I think it's only when you get to a position when you don't get education, like in South Sudan now, for example, or in many other countries where there is no education, there's great hunger, that people start looking around. But frankly, it was just something you took too much for granted.
Right.
And it's not sexy enough.
Let me bring you in over here. If we get a microphone to the bow tie, please. And then we'll take the orange tie.
My name is John Levine, and I was the dean of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and I ran newspapers and magazines and film companies before that. I think there's a more fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that until the recent era, news was breaking news. We had a monopoly, all media did, to some degree, and so we covered what happened yesterday. School board meetings are really boring. Most things that happened yesterday are really boring. Sadly, we in the media have not made the transition to the degree we should. U.S. News is a good example of an exception to that. But if I walked into those two news organizations and I heard somebody in television say that there is no visual in that, I think it's just not true. If we took the story that yesterday the schools decided to have a reading program for elementary and secondary and students, and we went back and looked at those for the last 2 years, stories like that, and then said, the story that they spent the money at the beginning is this long. The story that matters is to have a calendar of events coming from all the things they've started to go see if they've had any impact. And I would argue that the impact 2 years later of squatting down next to a third grade child as an adult and reporting to the community what learning to read is about, or talking to employers and high school students about what colleges they got into or what jobs they're not getting into, would be something the community would have huge interest in. But in our heads, the picture was you cover the bureaucrats and you cover yesterday, and then there are no visuals. Mm-hmm. Now, fortunately, some of the new media are starting to say we're not going to stick with that legacy model. Some legacy companies are breaking it, and some others are breaking it. But it's there, and if schools don't say we have a story to tell, and we're going to be transparent and tell it, and the media doesn't change its model, then we deserve what we get. Well, but there's plenty there to do.
I think you've touched on a very important element, and part of it is, of course, the development of the multi-platform age, and that is going to transform things. And many schools, of course, have got their own websites and all the rest of it and are able to. The legacy can do it, and we'll explore it a little more in a moment, but let me bring you in next.
Yeah, my name is Abdullah Raven. I used to be the Assistant Director General for UNESCO, responsible for media and communication. And before that, I was president of a very large university with a little over 3 million students population.
You are the perfect customer. You combine both elements of our debate.
Precisely why I decided to intervene. Media is a very important part of social institutions. When you look at the number of hours per week, we're told that something like children watch television alone for about 21 hours a week. But at the same time, during this period of exposure to television, they also watch 200,000 acts of violence, murders, killings on television screen. The blood is splashed on television screens on a daily basis. So media as a social institution can play a positive role, and I will give you an example of a positive role of media, but it is also unfortunately playing a very negative role in society today. Now, this morning the discussion was that health sector is able to attract more funding than education sector. Now, when you take the argument that education is an enabler for all other social services and activities, then why is it that education does not get the same attention as other social issues? Take, for example, environment. Just one more example of environment was not in the forefront of the social agenda until the media really started noticing, and thanks to Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, that it came to the fore. Today, environment is on top of the agenda. Unless the media decides to take education and engage in strong advocacy in raising the issues of the children deprived, the corruption. You say in media is, education is not a sexy issue. Come with me to India, and I will show you a lot of corruption in education.
So let me just make if I can make a radical proposal, sort of picking up on Anvar's point, and that, which is maybe we need to take the education beat out of the education page and put it on the business page. I think one of the issues that's come up in this conference in a couple of very provocative discussions was this education is a lot about the economy. It's a lot about jobs. And I think when you frame it as a jobs issue, it takes on much more urgency. And I think maybe, using the analogy with healthcare and how we began to see healthcare through a different prism, I think there may be an opportunity there for education. I don't know if any newspapers are going to pick that up. Certainly we look at it that way at U.S. News as a consumer issue. It is about individual people making choices that have to do with their livelihood. And I think we have framed it more of an abstract policy issue in too many ways. So,
surely one of the reasons why healthcare, long beyond the Obama healthcare bill, is such a big issue is because there are big commercial interests in healthcare, and they're trying to break into markets all over the world. In Europe, they're already in America in a very big way, and that, of course, makes it an economic story as well as one about health. Now, that is just beginning to happen in education too. There are big commercial interests trying to break into education. Doesn't that mean that we will be discussing it perhaps in commodity terms rather than in content terms?
We may well be discussing it in commodity terms. I would argue that I don't have a problem with that. I think we have to be realistic about this. Education is a commodity of sorts. Certainly in the higher education field and in the private field, it's extraordinarily expensive commodity, and people are very concerned about getting return on their investment. And I think you have to treat it that way in some instances.
Let's go back to our audience, and there's a question here.
Hi, my name is Yara Darwish, and I'm actually a wise learner, and I'm a journalism junior at Northwestern University in Qatar. So you've been talking about the lack of education coverage in Western media, but actually we see the opposite happening here. Here there is an increased interest in education, and it is heavily covered in our local media. We actually have an education journalism class taught to us in university. So, and people that are being critical may blame this on the political agenda of the country. So how can we revive the newsworthiness of education in Western media in order to meet up to the interests and needs of this region of the world?
Well, it's very interesting because Gordon Brown this morning in the plenary, the first part of the day, mentioned Malala. Malala single-handedly, in the most painful and horrible way, has brought the question of women's education, girls' education, right onto the front page of every newspaper in Britain, every channel in Europe. It is an enormous story, but it's taken the most horrible and traumatic event to bring it to people's attention. The Olympics and the issue of, which was raised by somebody yesterday in one of the sessions, as to why there were so few Saudi women athletes competing. These issues only seem to occur in terms of mainstream Western news consumption when something awful happens. I don't know, what do you make of that?
I think there is coverage of education in the West when, for example, people are worried about the results of schools. I think you remember in Britain this happened. when suddenly
But her specific issue, these questions like women's education, the deprivation of education in the developing world, those things do not make it into the mainstream.
They don't, because I think by and large, education, access to education is open to everyone. So the only exceptions might be people coming from certain very, very traditional societies who might not want to take opportunity of that education. So it is not a story as such, because you get it. It is there. It is available. So the only thing
60 million is a big number.
60. We were talking about the Western press.
Well, I was talking about the press generally.
The press generally, again, as you said, education is quite important. I think in India it is also very important. But I think you'll agree with me. It's only again when you have corruption issues that crop up that it really takes on a certain kind of a public nuance. And in Africa, it's also very similar in many ways. But hopefully, events like this might shift the focus away from education as an event leading to other events, and we might have a little greater coverage of education as we go on.
I just want to answer directly that it's true that the news agenda decides in general the coverage of the channel, but it's not just in a direct way. For instance, in the last 2 or 3 years, we have been covering a lot of education issue, and I don't talk about learning world, but in news or in social reports because of the economic crisis. So it depends on the circumstances. We had a number of stories about students studying new languages in order to immigrate and to find a new job, and also teachers moving in Europe or outside Europe to find a job, Portuguese teachers going to Brazil or to Africa to work. So education is a matter for news in a large meaning, I want to say. And it depends on the news agenda, but also the general trend, let's say, because, for instance, environment, it was really fashionable till up to some years ago, but now, because of the economic crisis, we don't have on the top agenda environment. You have to recognize that the importance is really low now. So, of course, the news decide everything, but then we can think about more in-depth coverage under different perspective.
So to Gardenia's point, though, I think, you know, there are news executives who make decisions like this, but there aren't that many of them anymore. I mean, when you think about, go back not many years, and there were probably 20 institutions at least in the Western media, but everybody read the Western media. So the New York Times, the London Times, BBC, ITV, there were a handful of institutions that were gatekeepers, and they made decisions, and they could make a decision to say, well, education's important, let's put it out there. That world is shattered now, completely gone. There are 2,000 institutions that matter in some form, and new ones being created all the time. It's a little scary because we're in the middle of this complete disarray, but I think it will reform itself. It is reforming itself. If you want, you know, keen education coverage about higher ed, there's a terrific online newsletter in the United States called Inside Higher Ed. I wake up in the morning and read everything I need to know about higher education. So the specialty publications, they could be regional, they could be subject specific. That's where I think the future is going to be, but it's going to be demand driven.
Yes, and I think this is where the multi-platform age is really, as you say, playing a very, very strong role. People think of Twitter as being in some way about 140 characters. It's not. It's about links. It's about leading people to water. I must say that I find myself retweeting or tweeting links far more than I ever make any statement in a tweet. And I think the demand for long-form journalism about education is strong, very strong. And as you say, there are now whole new resources that are growing up. So it's bad news and good news. And I think the good news is on the expansion. The bad news is where it's always been. There was a question, I think you wanted to ask a question, sir, or make a point.
Partly covered, but I just wanted to make one comment about the issue of why health gets more support. I'm a retired president of a university and a former minister of education from Pakistan. And I've done a lot of work on health and education. Health is something you invest in 2, 3, 4 years, whether it's research 4 years, 5 years, you get a payoff. You give an injection to somebody, you get a tablet to somebody, they're cured in a matter of days or weeks. But education is a matter of a whole generation. And politicians are the biggest enemies of education, quote unquote, because they want to show results in the 4 years that they were in office. And this is not something you can turn around in 4 years. You can have an immunization program and eradicate polio or whooping cough or whatever in a given district. But you cannot educate everybody in those 4 years. And the next guy comes along, and he also wants to, or she wants to build schools, but not the teachers. So it's a very different thing, and it is very easy to lull ourselves into saying, health has done it, let's take a, it's a different animal. It's a very complicated thing.
It's a very, very interesting and helpful observation. It's also got us off the hook. You've delivered us the best soundbite of the afternoon, which is, it's politicians. They live in the short term. It's not our fault. But of course it is partially our fault, because we also live in the short term, because we live in the short term of needing to make profit. So let's then talk about the media as, how should I put it, an accidental educator. I think what you described was an essentially accidental educator.
Yes, I think we were an accidental educator. It was very much demand driven. People wanted to know these things, so therefore we gave it to them. That was also our niche into the market. But I think one other reason why perhaps education has not got the kind of coverage that perhaps health has got is that education by and large has always been public. And it hasn't really involved, as you mentioned, hasn't involved large sums of money or investments or companies producing things, except for a few books here and there, which have usually come from outside, especially in the case of Africa. So there's never been anything really ongoing. The question has always been, how much of the budget do you allocate to education? How much do you allocate to other things? Now, with the increase of private education in Africa, and it's going up by the day, now we see a great deal more of debate, public debate, about private education, the cost of private education, whether public education will suffer as a result, and so on. So now we're beginning to see, for the first time, a real debate and discussion going on about the provision of education.
What about US News and World Report as an educator? I mean, leaving out the whole aspect of education that you cover for other reasons, what about as an educator about specific issues? Let's say we have the case of Malala. Suddenly, surely you have to explain to people how it is that there are girls who are deprived of education. So there is an educative role there, isn't there?
Well, yes, there are two parts to that, John, and some of it is if you look at U.S. not to dwell on U.S. News, but it's an interesting case study. You know, we were a traditional news magazine founded in the 1930s. We have really remade ourselves as a digital publication. We probably have 6 times the audience we did. We have about 15 million people a month coming to our website. But they don't come for a package like a magazine. They come for all different kinds of things. So they might want to read about Malala. Our news editors will be making real-time judgments about how interesting that story is. In the old days, it was top-down. I'm the editor. I would say, that's an important story. Put that on the cover. I can't do that anymore. They're looking at it on a minute, minute-by-minute basis. They're saying...
Your output is being edited by your consumers.
I am at the bottom of the food chain now. It's frightening. I mean, you know, I used to be a gatekeeper, and I'm not. And damn it, it's not... But it is what it is. I'm living in that world. But it is completely reversed, just to take us as an example. So it is a bottom-up. It's, you know, they'll put up that story, and how many people are looking at that? Do they want more information on that story? It's the audience demanding that. That's what you're really seeing. The other piece that we do is the more consumer information, where we're actually going out there saying, we're going to help you find a job. We're going to give you tools to find a college or a hospital. That's a very different way of looking at journalism. We had a thing that... It was a tradition in the magazine called News You Can Use. It was a section of the magazine, and it always made me think, geez, if we have a News You Can Use section, what's all the rest of the magazine? You know, the news you can't use. But it really does give you a delineation that the people are going to get what they want in this marketplace, because that's the way the internet works.
Are you still the gatekeeper, or are your viewers telling you what you should be doing?
Both are true because of the market and the environment that is changing all the time. Forces us to change our strategies. And of course, the main strategy now for the media, the biggest, is the new media, of course. And using the new media for delivering content and also for getting feedback from the viewers, I think that we are recovering some kind of role of educator, because we can have a direct relationships with the viewers. In general, with the classic TV, you are sitting in front of the screen, you change with the remote control, and the relation stops there. Now I think that despite of the content, you can have produce a good or bad content, but you can have a real educational relationship with the viewers, also if it's not the main aim, but in fact, this is the reality.
But what you have both described is effectively the democratization of the mass media. And that is an amazing moment, because it means that everybody in this circus here, for example, really has a chance to influence what is in the media. The capacity to contribute material, for example, has vastly increased because of the ease of sending it in and the rest of it. But so too has the capacity to affect demand for subjects. I mean, you know, somebody with a good membership of an NGO can whistle around their membership and say, get some emails into, get some tweets into whoever, and see if you can get them to do something on this subject. And invariably, I think you tend to if you get enough of them.
Well, I also think, you know, not only get them, the media to do something. People come to me and say, gee, why don't you write something about my organization? And I say, your organization is a publisher. Why don't you publish your own story? I mean, everybody in this room who has, you know, a connection to an institution could do the story that they want me to do, and as long as they could find a way to get it picked up, it would have as much impact and value in many cases. Everybody's a publisher today. So, you know, that, as you say, John, that works both ways. There's a point I want to make later about the downside, but it is an opportunity.
Okay, well, let's keep with the upside for the moment. But there's a point here, yes. And then we have a point over here.
Hello, I'm Catherine Adams from the United States. And the point you were making about the media being explainers or educators, and explainers versus educators, I think when we talk about the new media, you really are shifting now to educators, that with interactive material and material where it links you to supporting articles. So you read one article, it leads you to a background story, leads you to a social interest story related to the same topic. You really are educators. So I'm wondering if you might comment on that and how it changes your responsibilities as journalists now that that is your changing role and the changing way that we consume media.
It's a very good question, because, of course, it coincides with the reality that all of us have been paring down our staff and the rest of it. Do we actually have the expertise to be an educator?
I think we have, not because I think that the journalists are the best people in the world, but because the basics, the fundamental values of journalists and educators are the same. You have to know your subject, of course. You have to be credible, you have to be trustworthy, you have to be serious, and you have to understand first and explain then. So I think that it's not a matter of reconsidering our job, it's a matter of reconsidering our skills. I think that there is a new category of illiteracy in journalism because of the new tools. So I think that it's a wonderful opportunity also for journalists to learn things, because with the social media we are in touch with the reality all the time. Okay, then we can discuss how it's possible to verify or not. So, but let's speak in general. For us, it's an opportunity to learn things from people. So the roles are also a little bit opposite now. I think that it's a very interesting phase for the journalism.
I just wanted to add something. I am sometimes a little bit worried that we are going so far with this interactive media, etc., we might be losing things which are extremely valuable and which might disappear completely off. I mean, BBC, for example, BBC Two, and even BBC One. When I came from Kenya, I was glued onto that screen because it explains so many things in such a fantastic detail. That the natural history series, for example, they were brilliant. There is no one now who can reproduce those kinds of programs. And I think if we lose that, and they all started off to try and explain the natural world, and then they've gone on, and now we can go right up to the moon and Mars and back, and go right down to the little ants and their lives. You know, and this is fantastic, and you learn things in such an entertaining manner. And I'm afraid that if we're driven entirely by what the public now wants, and we lose this kind of ability to produce this kind of programs, then we will also lose a huge way of learning.
Well, I argue that we can do both, but we will deliver it in a different way. You say that there's nobody who can do this, but you see there are channels now that have grown up, which were not there when you were coming back from Kenya. National Geographic, they've got loads of money they spend on incredible natural history stuff, etc., etc., etc. It seems to me that we now have an opportunity that humankind has not had ever before. It's on a fantastic scale. The only slight problem is that we conventional media may go bust before we have found a method of earning money to stay in business to deliver what this vast new opportunity has for us.
You can't have a conversation about the media without looking at the business model or the broken business model. In the first 6 months of this year, Google sold more advertising than every newspaper and magazine in the United States. On a dollar-for-dollar basis, took every dollar spent on magazine and newspaper advertising, Google, which has been rising like this, and they've been declining like this. So you look at numbers like that. The internet is a force of nature. It is not, nobody, you can want anything to happen, but you're not going to make it happen. The internet is one of the most powerful things we've ever seen. So the question is, how do you harness it? How do you try to make it work for you?
You have something like the Guardian newspaper in England, which had a circulation of, I don't know, about 400,000, not very many, but has a website that is hit by 18 million hits a day, but they are losing money hand over fist. So, you know, there is this very awkward moment in humankind's opportunity where the money, the opportunity don't yet fuse. I'm going to turn to you. Yes, indeed. Sorry.
Is it still on? I know the conversation's moved on a bit, but just a point that was made previously by a few of the members. Bad news sells. That's a society issue to discuss and a psychological question. But I work for Siemens, and we're trying to promote engineering and technology. And we're involved in a project in the UK that has every single cool, sexy bells and whistle you would want. It's about teams of students designing and building a car. The annual final is held at the Goodwood Festival of Speed. The race is started by Lord March. Dave Richards, chairman of Aston Martin's involved. It's got everything, kids, engineering, but it's successful. It's good news. And we cannot get the media to come out and cover that. And it's got everything. It's got, you know, famous people, a famous historic racetrack, good news. None of the media turned up, not even the print. And it's 2 hours outside London.
I must admit, we always look for a bit of good news. We found one the other night. We found Rod Stewart crying at Celtic beating Barcelona. And we were able to end a very awful day of news with one happy thing. But we'll keep a lookout for your project and see if we can't do something. Nothing like a hard sell in a big meeting. Yes, come back, sir. Yeah, why not? Come back.
I heard the discussion about the new media and the risks that we run, and I think your own response was very balanced. There's one thing about journalism that we mustn't forget, and it's the human interest aspect. That's a lesson out of journalism, and let me illustrate that with Malala's story. The fact that women's schools, girls' schools, were bombed for a long time in Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan has been a known fact. So Malala didn't produce anything newsworthy there because it was always happening. They were after those who were providing education. Why did the Malala story hit the news across the world? It was the human interest of a young woman who was shot at point blank. She was able to survive. If she had died right there within 24 hours, a very good send-off and the story would have finished. The fact that she went to London, there was a human interest follow through. There is a huge interest in the Western world about what we could do to save this. So I think that the basic point I'm making is that it is the human interest aspect, not just the disaster aspect. So if you can create the good old, if you can continue to create the good old principle of human interest in journalism, because that's what sells. It isn't the girls' education that was selling. It was Malala's condition that was selling.
I think the question which then flows thereafter, once you've got through the value of the human story, there is this question of what happens after that. When does information cease to be education and become propaganda? So, for example, if I take your excellent example of young people's creativity and capacity to use science, etc., 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 when does it become propaganda for Siemens? Or, well, I mean, you know, when does it... The danger always is that you are going to eventually arrive at a place where what you're covering is something which is serving somebody's commercial interest.
It wasn't the push about, you know, Siemens. It's run by a charity, and it's been running in the UK for 10 years. But it's good news because kids are doing great things. They're learning, going on to higher education, engaging disenfranchised kids. But because it was a very good news story, the media did not want to turn out. Now, if there had been a crash and 3 kids had been killed, they'd have been all there.
Yeah. Well, it's a big, big problem. There's no question that the whole issue, and this will be probably well known to you on your course as well, that bad news does sell. That people want to know about people who are in a worse condition than they are, because they feel better when they discover that somebody else is having a worse time. I believe that to be the explanation.
Well, I think, you know, and that has a two-sided coin, John, as you alluded before, is that the democratization of the media does tend to flow to a least common denominator in terms of those stories. Okay, fine, that's not going to change. What I worry about is the notion of the elites. And you know, it sounds like a terrible word. I don't mean it quite that way. But there needs to be a transmission belt for an elite audience, and I don't think there's any subject that fits in that more than education. You know, it is not an obvious economic good for all the reasons that people have been talking about here. Somebody has to take a top-down approach and make judgment calls that we need to spend money on education, we need to reform it. Where is that information being exchanged? You know, at this conference, which is great, and you're starting to see, interestingly, more of these kind of conferences. We're in the conference business because we think there's a valuable way of transmitting information to a more elite audience that's not just going to be clicking on Google and getting the latest headline. Are there publications, you know, there's a handful left anymore, The Economist, things like that reach that audience. But I think that's a big shortage where the people globally who need to be having a common dialogue are not necessarily communicating as well as they could.
Well, and maybe we could say that, like many conferences, this conference, the acid test may well be what goes on in cyberspace afterwards. How much dialogue will there be between the people who've been here, attracting other people to come in on the dialogue from outside? How much fertilization will flow from this event? How good will we be at using the opportunities of the multi-platform age?
I just want to complete the answer to our friend, just to say that sometimes it looks that TV or media takes decision for political reason or whatever. Sometimes the reality is really simple and stupid. We cover something if we get the pictures or not. So it's the story of the young girl. It's becoming, it's really famous now. Also because we received the pictures, we went to the UK, and we all had the opportunity to see her, to have comment. We have every day thousands of untold stories, because we can't tell this story, because we can't show them. So as I was telling in the beginning, to look for stories and to go far from our center of production and to film it, it's really costly.
But even that is changing. I give you the example of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, nobody was there when the 40,000 Tamils were wiped out by government forces in the very closing days of the war. But the people had mobile phones. For the first time in history, you had a situation in which a massacre was filmed by the victims. Many of the mobile phones were recovered. Enough people lived who had witnessed what had happened and filmed it. And so that we put together a documentary at Channel 4, which was called Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, not one frame of which was commercially shot. Every single picture was shot by a participant, by somebody there, either from the Tamil side or from the Sinhalese side. And it was a breakthrough moment, because in Rwanda, in Srebrenica, there were no images. There was nothing to prove it had happened. And therefore, in a sense, the vastness of the story was reduced. Sri Lanka, the victims actually told their own story, some of whom never lived to see the fact that the story was told. And that's got to be a transformational moment. It'll never be possible again, and that's not a wholly developed country, for an oppressive regime to kill its own people without anybody ever finding out.
Of course, it's a tricky weapon for the journalism as well, as we said before. Of course, there is the problem of verification of what is going on, but it's true also that we were discussing just before the meeting here, also the mistakes now for journalists are less serious, are less important than in the past few years. Now you have a headline on the website, maybe you make a mistake, 2 minutes later it's corrected and nobody cares. So everything is changing.
But in Kenya, for example, the same Ushahidi system was used the other way around completely during the violence in 2007, when there was a lot of disinformation put on in the public space. And a great deal of the rioting that happened, and a lot of the killing, came about as a result of misinformation by people who knew how to use social media. And one of those persons is now going to be standing trial at The Hague for doing precisely that. And the feeling is that had he not done it, had he not misinformed people, and he didn't do it through the official channels, it's all done via the mobile phone and Facebook. So it's a double-edged sword, and how we're going to take it, I think, puts a lot of onus on the public broadcaster.
Well, that takes us really to where we should start to produce some conclusions. We're living in an age of opportunity and an age of risk, high risk in terms of distorted information. That's a serious issue. And it's a serious issue for the media to tackle if it seeks to be an educator. And I suspect we do seek to be educators.
I think we seek to be information providers. I think that to say educator probably crosses a little far for me, but I will admit I don't know where this is going. You know, at the risk of using a baseball analogy at an international conference, I'll probably fall on my face. If the media business was a baseball game, we would be in the first inning. And I have to append, there are 9 innings in baseball, right? So I guess that's clear. But we've got a long way to go, and you really have to be very humble about understanding what's happening and really trying to iterate on a daily basis and see where it's going to go. Hopefully, John, you're right. There's more good than bad here.
I think our role is changing very much. I don't think we are so important as information providers. There's plenty of information. In fact, I think there's an information overload. And a lot of people from now want information explained to them or analyzed, which again gives the onus back to you as a broadcaster or you as a publisher, because you're still deciding what people will finally decide or agree on, because you will analyze what they're doing. So I don't know how far we have actually moved down this line.
Well, there is another area of good news. And the good news is that distance learning, which was once dependent upon traditional outlets, traditional terrestrial outlets, has been completely liberated by the digital age. And so tailored distance learning that doesn't require the media to do more than generate some content and make it available has really been freed from the shackles of I'm afraid you can only have 2 hours. I remember the Open University in Britain, you used to have to be up at 2 o'clock in the morning to record your lectures, and you would get from 2 until 5 a.m. to get the material from which to learn. Those days are over, and that's got to be good news. We're now talking about an age in which a whole different range of platforms are now available for distance learning. And that's probably the greatest educational breakthrough that's occurred in our new multimedia age. Would you not agree?
Absolutely. I think, and that, again, we're just beginning to see the start of that, and that is going to be transformative.
And look at this country. I mean, we've got, I don't know how many universities are located here. Something like 6 or 7 American universities have outposts here. And they must entirely be, they must be extremely dependent on the new media age. So we're concluding that there is good news in terms of access, opportunity. There's bad news in terms of the old media's capacity to rearrange its financial model to take advantage. But you got the good news that you found a way of embracing the new age without losing your principles. You are still the organ you were, but you just manifest in a different way.
So far, we have been fortunate. Yeah, we maintained our DNA and transformed it into the new media world, and it's working well for us. We're very happy about it.
And you are still basically, in your African spread, effectively old media.
We are effectively old media, and we don't really have any intentions of changing yet, because we have had the best 10 years of our existence.
I'm not worried that you've got another magazine opposite you, which in the first world has really had to sort of more or less not say yet goodbye, although Newsweek have said goodbye to their hard copy.
Yeah. But they were in the 9th innings when we hadn't started our first. So we've got a bit more time to go yet.
I just want to add the bad news, because you say the good one. So I think that the bad news is always the same. If school were more efficient, TV wouldn't be as powerful. So I think that we have to, this is a contact point between education and information. Sometimes TV fits where the lacks, the weakness of education are. So I think that it's bad news anyway.
Are there any more points from the floor? Well, then I think that this has been a very interesting session, because it started with a confession, and the media doesn't often make a confession, and that was that we don't cover education well. But we've managed to end it with a really, I think, hopeful, positive, and optimistic message that it's all there for every one of us, whether we be in NGOs, in government, in educational institutions or whatever, to seize hold of and contribute. It no longer belongs to anybody who can shut us out. We have vast opportunities, and if we, conventional media, can adjust ourselves, we too can join you and take the same opportunity. I'd like to thank our 3 guests very warmly, and even more, I'd like to thank you for being such an excellent audience. Thank you very much.